Magna Vision. Australian owned, Australian made.
A Eurostar train sweeps through the green fields of southern England. Accelerating through the Channel Tunnel to 300 kilometers an hour, it will tear across northern France, arriving in the center of Paris some 3 hours later. At first glance, this would appear to have little or nothing to do with space at all. Across the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, at the European spaceport in French Guiana, South America, another Ariane rocket approaches the final stage of the countdown. Once the launch sequence computers are satisfied that all the many control systems on the rocket and the satellites are working correctly, the main engines are started. Ignition and liftoff. The statistics are impressive. From 0 to 3,600 kilometers an hour takes 60 seconds. 10 minutes later, Ariane is traveling at 9 kilometers a second, 33,000 kilometers an hour. The communication satellites on this launcher were probably worth 10 times the cost of the rocket. For this reason, protecting them is paramount. They must survive the incredible accelerations, high levels of radiation from space, the thermal shocks of extreme temperatures, meteor collisions, and a babble of high-frequency electronic noise from Ariane. To do this, space engineers have had to develop a whole range of new lightweight materials and filters. The hidden side of space is often to be found in very ordinary places, doing very ordinary things in ways that are sometimes extraordinary. That is how these new technologies found their way from Ariane into the Channel Tunnel and onto the high-speed Eurostar trains. As the exploration of space got underway in the 1950s, the benefits of what would become known as spin-off technology were not apparent. In part, this was because the race for space was mainly about the speed at which two massive superpowers could compete with each other. Indeed, spin-off technologies were not even considered relevant in the beginning. That quickly changed, often with bizarre consequences. This robotic insect-like creature was an early and unsuccessful prototype for a lunar rover. Its designers were enthusiastic about its potential.
The prototype you see here is able to negotiate uneven, rocky terrain with relative ease. By remote control, the lunar walker can be steered in any direction. It has the capability of traveling up an incline, and small obstacles do not halt the vehicle.
Astutely, they'd also realized that the improbable machine should also have benefits beyond crawling across the dust-covered surface of the moon.
A handicapped person in such a chair is able to navigate in a manner never possible in an ordinary wheelchair. A sandy beach presents no obstacle to the walking chair. It is now being tested on crippled children at a rehabilitation center in Southern California, and is expected to be on the market soon.
It never made it to the moon or into commercial production, but other clever technologies did. The Apollo missions to the moon brought thousands of photographs back to Earth. Researchers wanted to get more information out of these images. Using 1960s computer technology, they began to design software that could reprocess the images to enhance the detail.
This picture, for example, shows a moon rock about 20 inches across. A part of the photo is hazy. But you see a much sharper image after computer processing. Note how the fractures become clearer, as do the rock fragments in the background.
The spin-off benefit of this was immediate, almost from the start. Technically, there was little difference between an image of a rock on the moon or an X-ray of the human body. Both could be enhanced to reveal hidden depths of information that had enormous value.
Here you see an original X-ray of a human skull. After computer processing here, you see a much sharper image. Here is the same original picture. Now we want to bring out the blood vessels in the highly exposed frontal portion of the skull indicated by the arrow. You see that the computer technique recovers those frontal blood vessels, permitting better diagnosis of patient problems.
So the real winner was medical science. The dazzling high-technology scanning equipment that now fills most hospitals and saves lives had its origins back on the moon. The European experience was much the same in the early days. Scientific research in Europe had begun early in the 1960s and as cheaply as possible. This involved packing equipment into the nose cones of small missiles called sounding rockets. But space and weight were at a premium on these tiny machines. Everything had to be made as small and as light as possible.
11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, feu!
The biggest problem facing the engineers were electronics. In the 1960s, electronics were still large, bulky collections of valves and transistors. As the Europeans graduated to their first scientific satellites, squeezing the electronics down became even more important. This early research was mainly concerned with exploring the Earth's magnetic field, something we know and see as the aurora borealis, the northern lights. But these early satellites also had to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, which encircle the Earth. This posed a risk to newly designed miniature electronic circuits. So the European scientists designed tiny radiation detectors to be stuck on the satellites. As the Americans had discovered, medical science would quickly become the main beneficiary. The tiny detectors, designed to measure radiation levels in space, could work equally well on X-ray machines in hospitals. They had a huge advantage over existing technologies. They were so small that they could simply be taped onto a patient. The benefit of this was mainly to cancer patients undergoing radiation therapy. The dose of radiation is very important. Too much, and the treatment can become worse than the disease. Too little, and there's not much effect. The rat-fed radiation detectors allowed hospitals to control and direct the X-rays with a precision that had not been possible before. These detectors are now in everyday use. The problems generated by designing and building satellites can be bizarre and very productive. Take something as simple as a piece of wire. Space engineers, struggling with the usual problems of cramming more and more miniaturized systems into their satellites, were experimenting with new materials to join the bits and pieces together. They took two metals, nickel and the very lightweight and strong titanium, and fused them together to produce an alloy, a blend of different metals. To their astonishment and delight, the new alloy had a very peculiar property. It was able to remember its original shape at a certain temperature. Space engineers could use this to get into difficult corners, something they came across every single day. They'd found a solution to an irritating problem. Because these inventive new ideas do matter, ESA has always been careful to protect them. Thousands of patents belong to the space agency and to the people who pay the bills, the taxpayers. Some years later, surgeons looking for better ways of repairing broken bones stumbled across the space agency's shaped memory alloys. Put the metal loosely on the fracture, and the heat of the body would trigger the memory of the wire, joining the awkward broken bones firmly together. Even more remarkably, surgeons soon realized that these shaped memory alloys could even be used to seal blood vessels together. The range of applications seemed almost limitless. The problem for the early European researchers was access to what is called the space environment, the strange world of weightlessness. Sounding rockets were the only route that Europe could afford to begin with. It was cheap and effective, but at best it provided no more than a few minutes of zero gravity. The huge attraction of the Russian space station Mir was that it was up there permanently. In scientific terms, this matters. The most productive areas of research are those in which long-term changes in weightlessness can be watched and studied over sustained periods of time, especially what are called the life sciences, how organisms, such as plants and animals, change in space.
А что за материал?
В Германии был, но самое главное, что почему фотон называется, что с помощью света нагревается.
For astronauts to stay up in space permanently on a space station, oxygen has to be produced. But what has this got to do with pandas? The answer is algae, slime. Fed with nutrients, algae turns carbon dioxide into oxygen, and because of this is a potential supply of oxygen in space in the future. All it needs to make oxygen is sunlight, and there's plenty of sunlight up in space. However, to make this work requires new technology, and in particular, tiny pumps to release fluids in a continuous flow. So scientists set about building the world's smallest pump, smaller than a matchbox. Small enough to put inside something alive. In this case, it was a panda in an American zoo. The zoo wanted the pandas to mate and needed to install something that would release hormones as a continuous flow inside them. The pump worked brilliantly. But the pandas were just not interested in each other. Far above the Earth's atmosphere, space, science and technology were beginning to combine into something very remarkable, and the connections with life on Earth were becoming full of extraordinary surprises. A space station or a space shuttle is in free fall, and so the effects of gravity are more or less removed from any equation. An opportunity, but also one that would lead to disaster.
So sieht der Astronaut die Erdkugel aus 400 Kilometern.
Werner von Braun, the German designer of the V1 and the V2, had laid the foundations of American space technology in the late 40s and 50s. He was the father of the mighty Saturn V. But it was President Kennedy's decision to send Americans to the moon that made the dreams become reality. Although the benefits of spin-off technology took time to sink in, the colossus of the US space program in the 1960s would have a profound impact right across American society. It would sow the seeds of the computer revolution that would sweep the planet a little more than a decade later.
17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 5, 4, we have ignition. All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff.
Even as NASA's astronauts were still on the moon, the US Space Agency was preparing for the future.
We'd like you to leave immediately.
Central to its thinking was the idea of a reusable space plane, a space shuttle.
I have a model here of the space shuttle. As you see, it resembles a double-wing airplane on top of a propulsion system. The system is going to be designed so all of the costly parts are reused.
NASA's vision of the shuttle's future was as broad as it was wide. Space trucks shuttling backwards and forwards to factories in space, manufacturing exotic new materials for industries back on Earth. Space was to become just another ordinary industrial resource. Just as we extracted oil from the crust of our planet, so we would now begin to exploit the space environment. It was a breathtaking vision. But in 1986, the fragility of the shuttle and the forced pace of the launch schedule would result in the tragic end of the dream.
Seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The future would be something much more ordinary, but no less incredible. There would be no giant leap forward to vast factories in space. The future would look something like this. Packed inside a standard air transport container, a small box of scientific research instruments called the European Retrievable Carrier, Eureka for short. It was no more than a simple platform with a solar power system and onboard housekeeping computers and communications links. It had been built by ESA as part of the agency's long-term microgravity research collaboration with the Americans. But within this apparent simplicity was a rich seam of scientific opportunity. It would be launched by the shuttle and then attached to a remote manipulator arm and released into space. There it would remain for months or even years. In a sense, long exposure platforms like Eureka were coming close to the earlier dreams of factories in space. Not because new materials could be manufactured in useful quantities up in space, but because of the information that came down from the scientific instruments and experimental technologies designed to make them work. Eureka contained a huge variety of different experiments, including technologies for looking out into the depths of space, into the mysteries of black holes and distant galaxies, to understand the fire in the equations. But the further one looks out into space, the harder it is to see anything. To solve this problem, European scientists had developed a new high-intensification photon-counting camera, a sort of light amplifier. But very distant objects present exactly the same problems as very small objects. These are bacteria, not galaxies. Placed under a high-intensification photon-counting camera, it becomes possible to look inside the genetic workings of bacteria, to help understand how they reproduce, react, or are stimulated, all the things that we need better knowledge of.
Right, okay, door closed. Okay, starting integration. There we are, wow. Oh, look at that. Wow. Just turn that down a little bit.
Bacteria are the oldest inhabitants of the planet Earth.
We'll now turn on the display.
We depend upon them just to stay alive.
And change the colour palette so that we can actually see the image building up.
But they can be killers too. It's from such new technologies that we derive new scientific insights. Plants can be subjected to the same photon intensification analysis. Put a piece of ice close to a tiny plant and it goes into shock.
Okay, Martin, ready?
The ESA technology, originally designed to search for worlds beyond the final frontier, can now explore the inner mysteries of life back in laboratories on Earth. One of the biggest disappointments of early manned spaceflight was the discovery of how sick some astronauts become in space. Despite the triumph of Apollo 11 and the first human being to set foot on another world, the missions were plagued by space sickness. Both the Americans and the Soviet Union began big research programs to try and find out more. Chronically sick astronauts are not much use on a spacecraft, and indeed can be very dangerous to have on board anything. The causes of space sickness are not difficult to understand. They're exactly the same as seasickness. As ESA prepared to collaborate with the Americans by providing a customized research facility for the space shuttle called Spacelab, European scientists were also preparing a series of experiments to help understand space sickness. These experiments focused on a structure inside the human ear called the labyrinth. Inside the labyrinth are heavy otolith crystals that float in a fluid. They tell the brain whether the body is standing up or lying down, accelerating or stopped. Human evolution intended these otolith crystals to work in gravity, not in space. But the body also gets information from the eyes and muscles. Spaceflight offered one way of fitting the different pieces of the balance mechanism together because it could remove the effects of gravity from the equations. So Europe's first astronaut, Ulf Merbold, was given the specially designed helmet to try and monitor the balance system by recording what was happening to the eyes, an indication of what the brain is trying to do. These video signals were transmitted live to the ground. Researchers soon began to realize that the information coming from the body's muscles was much more important than they'd thought, and this information was simply missing in zero-G. They also realized that the results of the research had applications far beyond spaceflight, everything from car sickness to diseases that affected the balance mechanism. Once again, it was ordinary people back on the ground who would benefit from fundamental space research conducted by human guinea pigs called astronauts. Turning space science and technology into something useful in everyday life is a complicated process. This is a lightweight, collapsible tube designed for spacecraft, but what possible use is it to anyone else? To work all of that out requires a very different way of thinking. Young people with fresh, original ideas that must find a way to get the new technology into the commercial marketplace.
You have to depend on it to give it a certain point.
Yeah, probably is different that way.
Yeah. Well, because you can never get it to...
There used to be an amazing cathedral.
Float on top of the water.
Or something.
You have trouble with the line that it disappears up on the side.
It's going to do this, isn't it?
That is exactly how the artificial nose got started. The Mir space station must generate its own atmosphere, and the balance of life-supporting gases can vary considerably. Worried by how this might affect sensitive scientific experiments, the European Space Agency funded a research project at Manchester University to try and see how gases could be analysed and measured with high precision, an artificial nose. The researchers developed a system which could fingerprint any smell. It could analyze each single chemical component and work out the ratios between them. There was nothing quite like it anywhere, and its applications were astonishing. Perfumes have their own special smells, but once fingerprinted, it becomes simple to separate the real thing from the many fakes that are sold to innocent customers. Wines have been sampled since time began by connoisseurs with what's called in the industry a nose, a special and delicate sensitivity to taste and smell. But now wines can also be reduced to a collection of digital code that is virtually foolproof. Spin-off technologies make space research worthwhile because they translate into new benefits, products, markets and jobs. Yet often they come into being by complete accident. However, sometimes space agencies set out quite deliberately to create technological revolutions, and when they do, the results can be devastating. Every minute of every single day, news is breaking somewhere around the world. We know this because we see it on our television screens. It may be shocking, it may sicken us, it may just be ridiculous. Or it may be irrelevant to us, but important to someone else. It can be disturbing. It may be entertaining. But it's the world we live in. Sometimes it's live, sometimes it arrives shortly afterwards as a news bulletin, and we can see it because it's brought to our television screens by the birds, the hundreds of telecommunications satellites that encircle our planet. It is a remarkable and largely untold story, a short journey that began with a smart idea and ended up as an enormous multi-billion-dollar business. The idea began in 1945. An obscure British magazine published an article which suggested that rockets could be used to launch artificial satellites into space. These satellites could then send signals around the Earth. The orbit was important, wrote the author. If its plane coincided with that of the Earth's equator, it would revolve with the Earth and would thus be stationary above the same spot. The author of the article was Arthur C. Clarke, and the orbit became known as the Clarke orbit. In 1945, it was an outrageous idea that no one took very seriously. For one thing, there didn't seem to be a particular problem to solve. Undersea cables had been around since 1858. High-frequency radio transmissions bouncing off the atmosphere could be used for telephone traffic, but the quality was poor and the service unpredictable. Sunspots or bad weather turned the signals into garbage. With the end of the war, demand for more and better international telephone services started to rise sharply. The immediate solution was to make greater use of the sea. Electronics had advanced during the war, and undersea cables could now carry telephone signals. Ships ploughed backwards and forwards across the oceans, dumping heavy copper cables to the sea floor. Arthur C. Clarke's idea of using space just seemed science fiction. Not in the Soviet Union, though. In 1957, the USSR stunned the world when it launched the first artificial satellite into space, Sputnik 1. It lasted for 2 months and did nothing more than send a few beeps back to Earth. The Soviets, at least, had read Clarke's article carefully. A frenzy of activity began in the United States as engineers raced to get satellites built and up into space.
Clock synchronized.
The speed was breathtaking.
Air buffers checked.
The air buffer is checked.
Okay, satisfactory. Calibration.
Within a few months,
Calibration's
the
normal.
US Department
Check.
of Defense launched the SCORE satellite and used it to broadcast a Christmas
Phone down
message
here.
from President Dwight Eisenhower. Arthur C. Clarke had also pointed to another use for artificial satellites, to send television pictures. He himself dismissed the practicality of this because television pictures involved huge volumes of data. In 1960, it was NASA that showed that Clarke was right about television as well.
That served as a reflector in the sky for earthbound transmitters.
The US Space Agency launched not a satellite, but a balloon, and bounced television pictures off it.
Of a man-made star zooming across the sky.
The race was on, although no one had much idea where it was leading to. However, one man did. President Kennedy had already set the United States of America on a course for the moon. But Kennedy had another vision of space that was largely ignored, but would change history.
This is another indication of the extraordinary world in which we live. So we're glad to participate in this operation, developed by private industry, launched by government, in admirable cooperation.
Following the early successes of the SCORE satellite and the telecasts on balloons, Kennedy firmly believed that life on Earth could be transformed by satellite communications. The result of this was a wildly ambitious bird called Telstar. The French and the British shared Kennedy's vision, and the three nations worked closely together to try and make something out of the tiny white ball of experimental electronics. The French developed ground receive stations at considerable cost along the Brittany coast. The British did the same from Goonhilly Down in Cornwall, constructing a massive parabolic antenna.
Launch director to mission director.
Mission director here.
Would you give me the mission status, please?
The mission is go.
Roger,
Across
thank
the
you.
Atlantic Ocean, the Americans prepared Telstar for its historic flight.
Roger. Report BTL status. BTL's ready. Launch director, we have received clear to launch.
Minus 50.
Start remote camera number 1.
Started.
Close blockhouse vents.
Close.
Console, start camera and mag tape recorders. Camera and mag tape on. Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5,
Open solo fuel vent.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Start.
On the 10th of July 1962, a Thor Delta rocket launched the remarkable bird into a low Earth orbit. It's unlikely that anyone at the time had much idea of the impact that Telstar would have, but there was a genuine sense of excitement nonetheless.
Tracking okay at DTL. Plus 70 seconds. Mark. DTL tracking first stage. Guidance. Okay. On course. Pitch up signal at this time.
But would it work? US Vice President Lyndon Johnson was about to find out.
Vice President, this is Fred Capel calling from the Earth station at Andover, Maine. The call is being relayed through our Telstar satellite, as I am sure you know. How do you hear me?
You're coming through nicely, Mr. Capel.
The first telephone message in the world, as a matter of fact, over an active satellite.
The progress of the satellite from the time it was launched early this morning from Cape Canaveral by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has been most gratifying to all Americans. I'm sure millions of them have been proud of this achievement, which is another first in our conquest of space.
However, the real excitement was about to begin. As soon as Telstar was within range of the USA and France, the first satellite television transmission would be attempted.
Telstar brings a voice and a face from France to the television sets of the United States. The next Telstar pass, we receive the dry understatement of our English cousins.
On my immediate left, I have John Taylor, who is in charge of our space research and development.
We just get an announcement right now. This is the French station, has the picture. It's an excellent, clear picture.
You mean we've made an international telecast,
We've made an international telecast.
Well, let me congratulate you.
Arthur C. Clarke's prophecy had been partially fulfilled. The birds could talk, and the planet had shrunk a little. But clever as they were all in low Earth orbits, and therefore did not last long or reach very far. Getting the birds up to the Clarke orbit was the engineering puzzle that now had to be cracked. The solution came from two young American engineers. They realized that by putting a motor on the satellite and launching it into what they called a transfer orbit, a power boost and some help from the Earth itself would carry the bird up to 36,000 kilometers, the Clarke orbit. NASA tried it in 1963 with a satellite called SYNCOM-2, and the trick worked perfectly. However, the satellite had few practical applications. It did not sit on the equator, but instead wobbled around in a 32 degrees orbit, moving in and out of range. The vision behind the Clarke orbit was a series of birds positioned over the equator, orbiting in perfect harmony with the Earth below. They would provide global coverage, allowing communications from any part of the planet. That had also been President Kennedy's vision of the future. Nations that talked together were less likely to go to war. But the value of this was incomprehensible to most telephone and television companies. They were unimpressed. Suddenly, this changed. On the 22nd of November 1963, 3 shots rang out in Dallas, killing President John F. Kennedy. SYNCOM-2 had the dubious and tragic distinction of carrying the terrible images from Dallas across the Atlantic to horrified European audiences. As the American-led telecommunications revolution was happening, Europeans had stood by and watched. Perceptively, they'd realized that the real commercial returns would eventually come from television, not telephones. But beyond that, they were unsure quite what to do next. As was so often the case in the development of European space programs, a solution was found that amounted to the right decision being taken for all the wrong reasons, combined with undeserved luck. The Europeans had almost forgotten a strange little organization they'd created years earlier called the European Broadcasting Union, the EBU. Its main claim to fame was the much derided, but very popular, Eurovision Song Contest. To relay television pictures, the EBU used cables owned by telephone organizations. The distribution was poor, the system had no flexibility, and it cost the Earth. The remote possibility of a European satellite communication system seemed too good to be true to the EBU.
Space. Der Weltraum.
It assumed, correctly, that what was needed to sort out the political impasse was a very positive customer who could set the technical specifications down very clearly. Into the political morass walked the EBU and the Eurovision Song Contest. But the political intrigues had resulted in a bizarre technical decision that would change the television industry forever. To satisfy the French, whatever the satellite was, it had to be European, not American. To satisfy the British, it had to make commercial sense. For the European engineers, this was an equation that did not work. The satellite design would have to carry up to 32,000 voice channels by the 1990s, and the best that had been achieved in the 1960s was just over 200. To do this, European engineers threw away the textbooks and pumped up the power of the transmission system from 6 gigahertz to 14 gigahertz, high enough for color television. The problem with such engineering is that it has a domino effect on everything else. Every other part of the machine's design has to be changed. The prototype was given the extremely boring name of the Orbital Test Satellite, OTS, and no one had the slightest idea if it would ever work. Nothing like this had ever been tried before. Despite all the design difficulties, OTS was finally launched by the European Space Agency on the 13th of September 1977. And was promptly blown to pieces by a faulty American rocket. Fortunately, ESA had had the foresight to build a backup satellite. The radical design of OTS led to a new set of technical standards for all birds and a charge by European industry into a new and dynamic market. The scale of this business quickly dwarfed the original public investment in ESA's experimental orbital test satellite. Today, it's not difficult to see why. A 24-hour television news service is one of the many businesses created by the birds. The banks of television monitors represent news coming in every second. They allow news editors to track other news telecasts or to monitor what are called feeds. A feed consists of video recordings made by a television news crew somewhere in the world. Usually this is no more than a journalist and a cameraman. Pictures are recorded and a small suitcase antenna relays the images to the nearest bird above. Thousands of such feeds are made 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Television pictures crisscross the Earth continuously, exactly as Arthur C. Clarke had predicted. Yet this is a tiny fragment of the global television market. A relatively new and dynamic market is called direct broadcast by satellite. To make all of this work, satellite designers have had to do two things: put more power into the birds and more transponders on them, receive and transmit antenna. This makes this generation of birds much larger than their predecessors. Satellite television channels are grouped together in what the industry calls bouquets and sold by subscription to customers with small receiver dishes bolted to the sides of their houses. These bouquets include everything from major sports events to 24-hour pop videos. To keep this market moving, television satellites are launched as fast as rockets, such as Ariane, can get them up into space.
Plates are open.
Feu. Allumage.
Ignition.
Ignition.
But in terms of design, this technology has gone about as far as it can go. The problem is the nature of a television picture. Vast quantities of information are carried up to the bird and back down again as waves, analog signals. These waves take up a lot of room. But if the analog waves can be replaced by a narrow stream of numbers, digital signals, then a bird can carry many more television channels. It can also do many other new things. Existing analog birds can carry up to 32 television channels. Their digital brothers can carry up to 500. But, perceptive as Arthur C. Clarke had been, he had overlooked an extraordinary combination of ancient Greek mathematics and an entirely new generation of birds. Birds that would once again revolutionize our lives. A yacht is in trouble and human lives are at risk. But where? A radio distress beacon fires a series of signals up into space. High above the Earth, the Global Positioning System, GPS, forms a constellation of 24 orbiting birds that cover the entire planet. Providing the distress beacon is within range of any of 2 of these, the position of the yacht can be known to within a few meters. The reason for the huge success of the GPS birds is the practical benefits they bring.
Swansea, good morning. Falmouth here, we've got a 406 alert for you.
Within a matter of minutes, a sea rescue is underway. Guided by the GPS satellites, the position of the yacht is known, as are the precise positions of all the rescue craft. In such moments of crisis, time can invariably make the difference between life and death. The mathematical principles used by GPS were worked out over 2,200 years ago when the Greek philosopher Hipparchus first started experimenting with triangles. He had realized that the distance of any object in space could be calculated by how its position changed as the Earth moved, because this generated an angle on one corner of a triangle that could be measured. The Global Positioning System uses the same mathematical principles worked out by these ancient Greeks. GPS and the new European Global Navigation Satellite System can trace their roots back to military origins. It was clear from the beginning that GPS would eventually have civilian applications. But as was the case with the television birds, the speed at which these new markets developed shocked their designers. GPS moved from being a closed military system to becoming a massive new business within the short space of just a few years. Most applications of the GPS system are surprisingly ordinary. The reason for this is that at any time on any day, most of us need to know where we are geographically. This can be as simple as being in a vehicle traveling from one place to another. Public transport services are now being operated on the basis of running timetables based upon GPS information. Even high-speed trains use the positional birds to track their journeys and stick to their schedules. The mathematics of GPS make it a simple system in principle, with some very complicated applications in practice. It provides fundamental information, such as knowing where numerous aircraft are in relation to each other, air traffic control.
Shamrock 654, taxi link 3, Foxtrots Echo 2, holding point runway 28.
Not bad for an idea that's over 2,000 years old. Probably one of the most remarkable applications of GPS was here, on the cliffs of Dover in the United Kingdom, overlooking the English Channel. Two engineering teams were working on a massive rail tunnel to run under the sea. One team was digging from the French side, the other from the English side. Heavy, dirty work far below the sea floor. They had to meet at a precise point in the middle. Using GPS positional data, that was exactly what happened.
They're through, they're through. They're through, hey! There's the handshake we've all been waiting for, Mr. Fag and Mr. Cosette.
Arthur C. Clarke could see much of this future back in 1945. Most of all, he understood that the ultimate value of space technology was in developing mundane new applications back on Earth, where they would touch the lives of ordinary people in extraordinary new ways. Looking back in 1994, he could write, "We had to outguess the future, to be so far ahead of the present that there was no danger of facts overtaking us. But some things happened far sooner than I predicted, and at an incredible pace.